My name is Claire Whitmore. I am 38 years old. And for most of my life I was the quiet one. Not the smart one. Not the successful one. The quiet one. As though silence was the only contribution I had ever made to my family's story. My mother used to introduce me that way at parties, with a small apologetic smile, like she was explaining why the third bedroom had been converted into a storage room. Functional. Unexciting. Easy to overlook. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, the youngest of 3 children. My brother Marcus is 42. My sister Joanna is 40. I am the one who got the grades no one mentioned at dinner, who won the scholarship no one framed on the wall, who left for university in a packed car while my mother stood in the driveway and talked to Joanna about Marcus's football game that weekend. I studied accounting. Then I studied harder. Then I spent 11 years building a career in forensic accounting, which means very simply I find the money people don't want found. I trace it through shell companies and misfiled documents and handshake agreements that were never supposed to become evidence. I sit across from people who believe they have been very clever, and I show them, page by page, exactly where they made their mistake. I am extraordinarily good at my job. I met Daniel when I was 24, at a conference in Chicago. He was an architect, quiet in the way that confident people are quiet. Not because they have nothing to say but because they are comfortable choosing when to say it. We were married 2 years later in a small ceremony in the English countryside, which my mother attended with the energy of someone who had been mildly inconvenienced by the travel. She had wanted a bigger wedding. Church. A reception hall with a seating chart she could control. What she got was 40 people in a converted barn in the Cotswolds and a daughter who, for one afternoon, looked genuinely happy in a way that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. Daniel and I moved to Manchester. We built a life, slowly, deliberately, in the way that 2 people build something when they actually intend for it to last. We chose not to have children. That decision was made carefully, together, over many conversations and one very honest night in our kitchen where we admitted to each other what we actually wanted. My mother called it selfish, then sad, then a phase. Then, after Daniel died, she stopped mentioning it altogether, which was somehow the cruelest version of all. We had 12 years. 12 years of Sunday mornings and work trips and arguments about small things and slow dances in the living room to songs neither of us could name. He died of a cardiac event on a Wednesday afternoon in March. He was 41. He was at his desk. His assistant found him. I got the call at 2:17 p.m. 3 missed calls from an unknown London number. One from his office. Called the office back. His assistant answered on the first ring, and I knew from the sound of her breathing before she said a single word. I drove to the hospital alone. I identified him alone. I called my mother from the parking garage, and the first thing she said was, "Oh no. What are you going to do about the house?" Not "I'm coming." Not "Are you okay?" Just the house. I should have understood then exactly what the next 18 months were going to look like. But grief makes you generous with people who have never earned your generosity. That was my first mistake. It would be my last. To understand what happened after Daniel died, you have to understand what my family looked like before he did. My mother, Patricia, is a woman who was built entirely around appearances. She grew up working class in Cincinnati, married my father young, and spent the next 4 decades treating respectability like a second religion. The house had to look right. The children had to perform correctly. Holidays were productions with assigned roles and unspoken scripts. Grief was a private matter, something you processed quickly and quietly so it didn't make the neighbors uneasy. She had 3 children and she loved all of us. I want to be fair about that. But love, in my mother's household, was not distributed evenly. It was allocated. And the allocation had a logic to it that I spent most of my childhood trying to understand before I finally accepted that some systems are not designed to be fair. They are designed to be stable. And stability in my family meant Marcus at the center and everyone else arranged around him. Marcus received the down payment on his first house, $47,000, wired quietly in 2016, mentioned to me only by accident when Joanna referenced it at Thanksgiving 2 years later. My mother did not deny it. She said it was a loan. Marcus, when I asked him directly, said he didn't remember the exact arrangement. The money was never repaid. No one followed up. It simply became part of the landscape, one of those family facts that everyone knows and no one names. In 2019, my mother co-signed a $90,000 business loan for Marcus's logistics company. I found out the same way I found out about most things in my family. Not because anyone told me, but because I was paying attention. She mentioned it to Joanna on a phone call I was present for, casually, the way you mention you've picked up someone's dry cleaning. A $90,000 co-signature. For a business that folded 18 months later. The loan was restructured. My mother absorbed part of the loss. She told me it was fine. She told me family helped family. I had never been offered help. Not once. Not with university. Not with the deposit on the Manchester flat. Not with anything. And I had never asked. Partly out of pride, partly because I had understood from a very young age that the offer was not available to me. The quiet one did not need help. The quiet one handled things. Joanna occupied a different position in the family hierarchy. Not the favorite, but the charming one. The one who moved through life on warmth and deflection and the goodwill she generated by being very fun at parties. She was the kind of person who made you feel, in her presence, that you were the most interesting person in the room, and then forgot your birthday 3 weeks later. She borrowed $3,400 from Daniel and me in 2020. A temporary cash flow issue, she said. She would sort it within the month, she said. 18 months later, when I raised it, carefully, privately, not at a family event, she told me I was being very transactional about their sisterly relationship. Daniel had laughed about it afterward, not bitterly. Just with the quiet amusement of a man who had long ago made peace with the people his wife came from. He was more generous than I was. He always had been. There were 3 specific moments before the funeral that I return to now when I need to remind myself that what I eventually did was not an overreaction. The first was Christmas 2019. My parents announced at dinner that they had updated their will. The family home in Dayton, valued at the time at approximately $310,000, would go to Marcus. My mother's investment account would go to Joanna. I would receive what my mother called the sentimental items. I asked very calmly what that meant. The photographs, she said. Your grandmother's china. Things with meaning. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table. I smiled and said that sounded lovely. That night in our hotel room I stared at the ceiling while he slept and I did the math in my head. Not out of greed, but out of the particular humiliation of being told, in the most civilized possible language, that you are worth less than your siblings. That the life you built, the career you built, the person you became, none of it changed the original assessment. The quiet one gets the china. The second moment was Easter 2021. My father had recently recovered from a minor stroke, and the family gathered at Marcus's house in Phoenix. At some point the conversation turned to my career and my mother said, in front of everyone with a pleasant tone of someone paying a compliment, Claire's always been very good with numbers, but I never quite understood why she didn't do something more, I don't know, visible. Joanna laughed. Marcus changed the subject. My father looked at his plate. Daniel from across the room caught my eye. He gave me the smallest, steadiest look I have ever received from another human being. Meant, I see you. You are not invisible to me. He was the only one who ever looked at me that way. And 4 months after that Easter dinner, he was gone. The third moment, and this one I have turned over in my mind more times than I can count, was 6 weeks before he died. Sunday morning. I was in the shower. Daniel answered my phone. When I came downstairs, he was standing in the kitchen with a strange expression. Not alarmed exactly, but careful. Considered. The face he made when he was deciding how to tell me something. My mother had called to ask if Daniel had considered getting his affairs in order. He was 41 years old. He had no diagnosed illness. No symptoms. Nothing. When he told her he didn't understand the question, she said she had just been thinking about Claire's future and wanted to make sure I would be taken care of. We sat with that over coffee. We agreed it was a strange thing to say. We did not investigate further because there was, at that point, nothing to investigate. A mildly odd phone call from a mildly difficult mother. We filed it away and moved on. What we did not know, what I did not know, was that 6 weeks before that phone call, Marcus had registered a limited company. And that company had already begun receiving transfers from one of Daniel's accounts. My mother knew. Believe she knew. The phone call was not concern. It was a timeline check. But I am getting ahead of myself. At that point I knew none of this. At that point I was simply a woman who had lost her husband and was trying to survive the weeks that followed, surrounded by a family that had already, quietly, begun to move. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't even close to the beginning. The Tuesday night phone call happened 9 days after the funeral. I had been existing more than living. Moving through the Manchester flat the way you move through a space when you are not sure you are still allowed to take up room in it. Daniel's coffee mug was still on the counter. I hadn't moved it. I wasn't ready. I had returned to work for half-days because the alternative was silence, and silence at that stage felt like something I could physically drown in. I was sitting on the kitchen floor. Not for any dramatic reason. My back simply hurt from the tension I had been carrying in my shoulders for 9 days, when my phone rang at 8:43 p.m. My mother. She did not ask how I was. She opened with, "I've been trying to reach you for 3 days." I'd seen the calls. I had not had the energy to perform okayness for her consumption. I told her I had been resting. "Well," she said, "I understand you're going through something. But life does go on. Marcus's son had his birthday on Saturday and you didn't even send a card. That child adores you." I looked at the kitchen tiles. I counted the grout lines between them. I did this sometimes in difficult conversations. A grounding technique my therapist had suggested, though I doubted she had anticipated it being used during a phone call with my mother 9 days after my husband's funeral. "I think," my mother continued, "that you've been isolating. And that's not healthy. You need to be around family." Then she said the word. "You need to stop wallowing, Claire." Wallowing. As though grief were a choice I was making for the attention it brought me. As though I was enjoying this. As though the coffee mug on the counter and the unworn side of the bed and the Wednesday afternoons I could no longer think about without my vision going white. As though all of that was performance. "Marcus thinks," she said, "that you should consider selling the Manchester property. It's a lot of space for one person. He knows someone in property who could give you a good valuation. There's no point being sentimental about bricks and mortar. The flat Daniel and I had chosen together. The flat where we had spent 12 years. Bricks and mortar." "Marcus thinks," I repeated. "He's just trying to help, sweetheart. We all are. Daniel's gone, and you need to start thinking practically." I told her I had to go. I ended the call. I sat on the kitchen floor for a very long time. The next morning the letter arrived. White envelope. London postmark. Addressed to the estate of Daniel Whitmore. It was from a property solicitor, a firm I had never heard of, in a part of London I associated with money that moved quietly. The letter referenced a preliminary valuation inquiry, submitted on behalf of a family representative, regarding the Manchester property. Submitted on the 4th day after Daniel's death. 3 days after he died. Before the funeral. Before the burial. Before I had chosen the flowers for the casket. Someone had already contacted a London property solicitor about my husband's flat. I read the letter 4 times. The way I read financial documents at work when I need to be absolutely certain I am not misreading the implication. I was not misreading it. The family representative was identified by initials only. M.W. Marcus Whitmore. I set the letter on the counter next to Daniel's coffee mug. I stood in my pajamas at 7 a.m. in the flat where my husband had lived, and I felt the last remaining warmth I had been extending to my family. Out of grief, out of habit, out of 38 years of keeping the peace. Leave my body completely. It was not rage. I want to be precise about that because it matters. Rage is hot and impulsive and it makes mistakes. What I felt was colder than that. Cleaner. The almost physical sensation of a long-held suspicion being confirmed. The relief, strange as that sounds, of no longer having to wonder. Called in to work. Took the day. Then I sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop, Daniel's estate folder, and every piece of family financial correspondence I had ever saved. Because I save everything, I have always saved everything. It is not paranoia when you grow up in a family like mine, it is preparation. I opened a new spreadsheet. I titled it simply, "What They Did While I Was Grieving." I started at the beginning, and I did not stop until I understood everything. That was the moment everything shifted. I need to explain something about forensic accounting before I tell you what I found because the context matters. Most people imagine financial fraud as something dramatic. Large wire transfers, offshore accounts, men in expensive suits making coded phone calls in parking garages. Sometimes it looks like that. But in my experience, 11 years of it, the money that people hide is almost never hidden dramatically. It is hidden in the boring places. In the CC field of an email. In a clause buried on page 11 of a property agreement. In a beneficiary designation that was quietly updated and never mentioned to the person it affected most. The boring places. That is always where I look first. Daniel had a will. I knew its contents completely. We had written it together in 2019 with a solicitor in Manchester named Mrs. Okafor, a careful and thorough woman who had walked us through every clause with the patience of someone who understood that estate planning is not about death, it is about love made legally binding. The Manchester flat was mine. His architectural practice and its assets were to be liquidated and folded into the estate. His 3 personal accounts transferred to me as sole beneficiary. Simple. Clean. Correctly filed. What I did not know about was the 4th account. Daniel had grown up in a financially complicated household. His parents had divorced badly when he was 11. Contested assets, prolonged legal proceedings, a childhood spent watching money become a weapon. As a result, he had developed, early, the habit of keeping one account that was entirely his own. Not secret from me. He had mentioned it once, in our first year of marriage, called it his just-in-case account. A holdover from childhood anxiety. I had not thought about it in years. The last time it had come up in conversation, it held somewhere around £18,000. When I pulled his full financial picture as part of the estate process, I found the account. It held £214,000. I sat with that number for a long moment. Then I found the deposits, 18 of them spread across 3 years. Each transfer between £8,000 and £15,000. Each one originating from the same source, a limited company I had never heard of, registered in 2020. Whitmore Property Consulting Ltd. I searched the company's house register with the focused calm of someone who has done this 10,000 times and knows exactly what they are looking for. The company had been registered in March 2020, had 2 listed directors, Daniel Whitmore and Marcus Whitmore. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. My husband and my brother had a business arrangement, one I had known absolutely nothing about. I sat with the complexity of that for a moment, the hurt of it, the confusion of it, before I set the personal feeling aside and looked at it the way I look at everything in my professional life. Structurally, legally, practically. Because what mattered in terms of the estate was not the emotional dimension of this discovery. What mattered was that Marcus was a director of a company that had been making regular transfers into an account that was now part of Daniel's estate. Which meant Marcus potentially had a claim, or believed he had a claim, or had been advised by someone that if he moved quickly and strategically enough in the days immediately following Daniel's death, he might be able to establish one before I fully understood what I was dealing with. That was why he had contacted the London property solicitor on day 4. He was not being helpful. He was positioning. Kept going. I am very good at keeping going. I pulled 3 years of emails my mother had forwarded to me. Holiday logistics, family updates, the mundane correspondence of a family that communicates primarily through scheduling. I searched every one of them for the company name. I found 2 references. The first was from 2021. My mother writing to Joanna. Marcus's little property thing with Daniel is going very well. He says it could be quite significant by next year. The second was from 8 months before Daniel died. My mother, again to Joanna. Marcus says the arrangement with Daniel needs to be formalized properly before anything happens. He's going to talk to someone about it. Before anything happens. I read that line 4 times. My husband was 41 years old. He had no diagnosed illness. He had no symptoms. There was no medical reason at that point for anyone to be thinking about what would happen to his assets. And yet someone was thinking about it. Someone had been thinking about it carefully enough to use that specific phrase, before anything happens, 8 months before his heart stopped on a Wednesday afternoon at his desk. I am not suggesting anything sinister about Daniel's death. It was cardiac. It was confirmed by 2 separate medical opinions. It was no one's fault. I want to be absolutely clear about that. What I am saying is that my family had been quietly preparing for a future that did not include me having full and uncontested access to what was mine. And Marcus had timed his move, the solicitor letter, the property valuation inquiry, all of it, for the precise window when I was most destroyed, most isolated, most likely to be too consumed by grief to read my own mail. He had been watching for the moment I would be weakest. He had simply forgotten one thing. He had forgotten what I do for a living. He had forgotten that I have spent 11 years being professionally undeceivable. He had forgotten that the quiet one, the one his mother introduced at parties with an apologetic smile, the one who got the china in the will, the one who was told to stop wallowing 9 days after burying her husband, had spent her entire career learning to find exactly what people like him tried to hide. I opened a second tab on my laptop, then a third. I was just getting started. What they didn't know was, I had only just begun to read. I did not call Marcus. I did not call my mother. I did not send an angry message or show up at anyone's door or do any of the things that would have felt deeply satisfying for approximately 4 minutes, and then handed them a narrative. The grief made her irrational. She was always difficult. You know how she gets. I had watched that happen to other women. I had watched perfectly reasonable people be reframed as unstable because they responded emotionally to things that warranted an emotional response. I was not going to give my family that gift. I had been the quiet one for 38 years. I was going to be quiet for a little while longer. Just strategically this time. The first call I made was to Mrs. Okafor. I told her I had discovered a company directorship and a connected account in the estate, and I needed to understand the full legal implications before I spoke to any other party. She told me to come in the following morning and to bring everything. I brought 43 printed pages. She read in silence for a long time. Then she looked at me over her glasses and asked, "Has Marcus Whitmore made any direct contact with you about the estate?" I showed her the letter from the London solicitor. The one with his initials. The one postmarked 4 days after Daniel died. She wrote something down, a single line which I did not try to read, and then said, "I'd like to refer you to a colleague. He handles contested estate matters specifically. I think you should speak with him before you respond to anything from Marcus or from that London firm." His name was Mr. Adeyemi. I met him 3 days later in a glass-fronted office in the city centre. He was in his mid-50s, unhurried, the kind of lawyer who speaks in complete sentences and never uses 2 words when one will do. I liked him within the first 5 minutes. which for me is unusual. He reviewed everything I had brought, the company registration, the deposit history, the emails, the solicitor letter, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The £214,000 in that fourth account is almost certainly part of the estate as written. Daniel's will is clear and correctly executed. Marcus's directorship in the company does not automatically entitle him to those funds." "But," I said, because there is always a but. "But," he confirmed, "if Marcus files a claim arguing that a separate verbal agreement existed, that the company funds were his contribution and Daniel was merely holding them, that becomes a dispute, becomes costly, it becomes time-consuming. And it becomes significantly harder to resolve cleanly if he has already established contact with a property solicitor and begun building a paper trail suggesting he had an ongoing financial relationship with the estate." Which was exactly what Marcus had been doing from day 4. "What do I do?" I said. Mr. Adeyemi looked at me steadily. "You act first, quietly, before he files anything." We spent the next 2 hours going through the options. When I left his office, I had a legal strategy, a timeline, and 4 specific actions to take before Marcus or his solicitor made another move. The first was to formally notify the London property firm in writing through Mr. Adeyemi's office that all estate communications were to be directed exclusively to my legal representative and that any further direct contact would be documented as potential interference with estate proceedings. This was sent the following morning. Certified. Timestamp. The second was to freeze the Whitmore Property Consulting Ltd company account pending estate review. Mr. Adeyemi filed the application. It was processed in 6 working days. Marcus received notification on a Thursday afternoon. I know this because Joanna called me that evening. Not to ask how I was, she never called to ask how I was, but with a strange, careful energy in her voice, asking if everything was okay with the estate stuff. I told her everything was being handled appropriately. She paused for a long moment and then said she hoped it wouldn't become a whole thing. "It won't," I said. "As long as everyone behaves correctly." She hung up shortly after. The third action was the one that required the most patience, which is to say it required a great deal of patience, because patience is not something that comes naturally when you are also grieving and exhausted and operating on 4 hours of sleep and 1 meal a day. But I had learned in my career that the most important moves are almost always the ones that require you to wait. I commissioned a full forensic audit of Whitmore Property Consulting Limited. Every transaction, every transfer, every communication that could be legally obtained. I paid for it myself, £4,200, which I considered the most important investment I had made in years. The audit firm I used was one I had worked with professionally. They were thorough and they were discreet and they did not ask unnecessary questions. What they found over the following 3 weeks was a company that had been structured, quite cleverly I will admit, to appear as a legitimate joint venture while actually functioning as a vehicle through which Marcus had been drawing funds that were not proportionally his. The company's income came primarily from 3 property consulting contracts. Daniel, as co-director, had brought in 2 of those contracts through his architectural connections. Marcus had brought in 1. The revenue split in the company accounts, however, showed Marcus drawing 63% of distributions consistently over 2 years. Daniel had not noticed, or had not cared, or had trusted his brother-in-law in the uncomplicated way that generous people sometimes trust people who do not deserve it. I will never know exactly which one it was. I have made peace with not knowing. What I knew was that the audit gave me something more valuable than anger. Gave me documentation. The 4th action was the one I had been saving. I had found in my review of the company emails, obtained through the audit process, a thread from 14 months before Daniel died. Marcus and a property developer in Birmingham. Discussing a deal. Discussing the company. And in one email, quite clearly, Marcus referring to Daniel as a sleeping partner who won't be an issue long term. Won't be an issue long term. I printed that email. I put it in a folder. I labeled the folder with a date and added it to the growing stack of documentation that Mr. Adeyemi's office was maintaining on my behalf. Then I waited. Marcus made his claim 6 weeks later. Exactly as Mr. Adeyemi had predicted. A formal submission arguing that the £214,000 represented his personal contributions to the company, temporarily held in Daniel's account by mutual agreement, and therefore not part of the estate. He submitted it on a Monday morning. By Wednesday, Mr. Adeyemi had filed our response, 47 pages, fully documented, including the audit findings, the distribution discrepancy, and the email in which Marcus had described my husband as someone who won't be an issue long-term. We requested a hearing. We also, and this was Mr. Adeyemi's suggestion, and it was a good one, sent a courtesy copy of the audit findings to HMRC. Because Whitmore Property Consulting Ltd. had filed 2 years of company accounts that did not accurately reflect the distribution structure the audit had uncovered. That is called tax discrepancy. And HMRC takes it quite seriously. That was the moment everything Marcus had been building began, very quietly, to come apart. The estate hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in a building in Manchester city centre that smelled like old carpet and institutional coffee. I wore a grey suit. I brought Mr. Adeyemi and 2 associates. Marcus arrived with his London solicitor, the same firm that had sent the letter on day 4. And a confidence that I recognized immediately as the confidence of someone who has never been genuinely held accountable for anything in their life. He looked at me across the corridor and gave me a small nod. Measured. Performative. The nod of a man who believed he was managing a situation. I nodded back. I did not smile. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Marcus's solicitor argued the verbal agreement position, that the £214,000 represented Marcus's personal capital, held in Daniel's account as a temporary arrangement pending company restructuring. It was a reasonable argument, constructed carefully, and it might have worked if not for the audit, if not for the distribution discrepancy, if not for 47 pages of documented evidence that told a different story with considerably more precision than a verbal agreement ever could. When Mr. Adeyemi presented the email, a sleeping partner who won't be an issue long-term, Marcus's solicitor asked for a brief recess. They were gone for 22 minutes. When they returned, the tone had changed in the specific way that tones change when someone has called their client into a side room and explained to them, carefully, that the position they arrived with is no longer defensible. Marcus's claim was withdrawn that afternoon. Formally. In writing. The £214,000 remained part of the estate, which meant it came to me. The HMRC inquiry took longer. These things always do. But it proceeded. Marcus received a formal investigation notice 8 weeks after the hearing. The company accounts were reviewed in full. The discrepancy, across 2 financial years, amounted to approximately £31,000 in undeclared distributions. He received a penalty notice. He was required to make full payment plus interest within 90 days. I did not feel triumphant about the HMRC outcome. I want to be honest about that. I had not reported the discrepancy to cause him pain. I had reported it because it was accurate and because accuracy, in my experience, has a way of mattering whether or not it is convenient. The Manchester flat was valued that spring at £580,000. I did not sell it. My mother called me 3 times during the hearing process. I did not answer. She left one voicemail which I have never deleted in which she said, and I am choosing my words carefully here because I do not want to misrepresent her, that she hoped I understood that family was more important than money, and that she hoped I would find it in my heart to consider what this was doing to Marcus and to all of them. She did not mention Daniel. She did not say his name once in that voicemail. That told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in the accounting of her heart, and it made what came next considerably easier. I had Mr. Adeyemi draft a formal letter to my parents.